The reference here that says trust in God, he says in verse 19, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God." That's important. That's an important verse. You see injustice and you burn with sorrow and anger because there's so much injustice. And verse 19 saves you from having to feel like, I've got to squash this desire for justice, and I've got to squash this desire to see the rights made wrong. And if I'm really like Jesus, cross out Jesus and fill in Gandhi or Buddha, I'll have no emotions and I'll just be passive. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is that God-given angst and anger about justice is righteous and right. It's just not in your hands to execute it. And so you open empty hands and lift them to heaven and say, God, how long until you accomplish this? You lift all those to God and you leave it in God's hands. And finally, in verse 21, the victory of love. Do not be overcome by evil. Check that out. But overcome evil with good. See the cumulative strength here. In verse 14, he said, when they speak evil things about you, speak words of blessing to them. Then in verse 17, he said, when they do evil things to you, don't retaliate evil actions toward them, but do good actions toward them. And finally, it's amplified in verse 21 to say, overcome their evil with good. This is the power of love. There's nothing greater than love, and there's nothing worse than a faker. It's so amplified here. Really, throughout Romans 12, there's simply 4 types of love. There's the love of one equal toward another. This is just the love of friendship, which we just smile and everybody gets this. The second type of love is love toward someone who's less fortunate than I am. This is weeping with those who weep. This is showing hospitality. And we get that. The world even gets that. That's compassion and that's sympathy. There's the love for equals. There's the love towards someone who's less fortunate. Third, there's love towards someone who's more fortunate than you. That's rejoicing with those who rejoice. That's not being haughty. That's not trusting in your own wisdom. And that's a little bit harder to do, but if we overcome envy, we can really rejoice with those who rejoice. And that's the third type of love. But it's not just love for an equal. It's not just love toward those who are less fortunate. It's not just love toward those who are more fortunate. Christian love, gospel love, is love for an enemy. And did you know that gospel love, love for an enemy, is the only kind of love that God was able to extend to you? Romans 5 says, while we were still enemies, Christ died for us. This is gospel love. This is otherworldly love that alone has the power to change the world. And so when we get to the end of Romans 12 and we say, I can't do this. I see what this means about what kind of person I would be if I was a more loving person and I can't do it. Maybe you're here and you say, I even believe that the Bible says this and I believe it would be good if I did this. But I just can't do this. What I want to say to you is first, I appreciate your honesty. To say, I would resolve to do this, and I know myself, Pastor, and I would do okay for about 42 seconds, and then I would fail. That's about right. That's about my speed. If you're saying, I can't do this, you're saying what I've said. I never could do this. I never could do this. And the only way that I became the kind of person who can do this is because God did this for me in the gospel. And now God does this in me by the fruit of the gospel. God the Father sent God the Son to die for me while I was His enemy. And God loved me in this way in the gospel by sending Jesus Christ for me. And now that Jesus Christ is victorious and has ascended, Jesus has sent God the Spirit to dwell in me. The only way that I've become a person who can do this is that God did this for me in the gospel, and now by the presence of His Spirit, God does this in me by the gospel. This is why Romans 12 follows the therefore in Romans 12:1. Love in our lives is only possible because of the way that God has loved us. There is nothing greater than love, and there's nothing worse than a faker. And the good news of the gospel is that God's love for you is not the love of a faker. It's not the love of a poser. It's not the love of a God who says, well, try to clean up your act and do what you can, and then goes on with His God life. The love of God for you in the gospel is the love of a God who looked at your helpless estate and said, there is no way that rebels and enemies like that could fix their state. And the only way for their state to be fixed is for me to give my own life for them. I love them enough to do that for them. The love of God in the gospel is not fake, nor is it sentimental. It is bloody and costly and the realest thing in the universe. And now, your right conduct in all of your relationships consists essentially in this: mimicking God's conduct toward you in the gospel. How you feel and act is to be nothing less than how God felt and how God acted toward you in the gospel. And that's what Romans 12 really is all about. How did God's love, verse 21, not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good? How did God, looking at the evil of the world, the same way that He did in Genesis 6, when the evil of the world caused Him to flood the world and destroy it all, but when the time for Jesus came, how did God's love see all the evil throughout all the world and then overcome that evil by the blood of the cross? How did the love of God forgive us when we did not deserve that forgiveness? Do not repay evil for evil. Love your enemies. Is that not the gospel of Jesus Christ and what He did for us on His cross? Verse 18 says, as far as it's possible, be at peace with all men. How did God's love make peace? Seemingly impossible. God's holiness demanded that your sin suffer in hell. God's love demanded that you be delivered, to be restored to a relationship with Him. And the only way for that impossible chasm to be bridged was for God Himself in Jesus Christ to take your place of punishment on the cross. How did God's love forgive us when we didn't deserve that forgiveness? How did God's love make peace with us when we didn't deserve that peace? How did God's love, verse 16, humble Himself and not be haughty and removed, but humble Himself in the incarnation of the cross? Verse 15 says we're supposed to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. Can't you see the blessed eyes of Jesus Christ weeping and weeping and weeping for sinners? And can't you see the blessed smile of Jesus Christ who sees for the joy set before Him, who sees that though I die, they will live. And I rejoice in the joy of their life. Christian conduct is actually a matter of entering into the spirit of God's conduct toward us in the gospel. The only way that's possible is because God has completed that good work in Jesus Christ. And the only way that's possible is God is now furthering that work in our hearts by His Spirit. Let love be genuine. There's nothing greater than love, nothing worse than a faker.